Welcome to this rapid revision session on the rising against Earl Tostig. Here's a bit of context to remind you. The Godwins were an incredibly powerful noble family in England in the era before the Battle of Hastings and the Norman Conquest. Earl Godwin, who died in 1053 and was married to Githa, had several sons, not all of which are listed here. First we have Harold Godwinson, then Tostig Godwinson, Edith, a daughter, Gyrth, Leofwine, and Wulfnoth. Here's how they are relevant to our story then. Harold became Earl of Wessex and Sussex in 1053. He led military campaigns and became very powerful and popular. He claimed the throne in 1066. His marriage to Edith of Mercia meant the Godwins either dominated or influenced every English earldom. Tostig became Earl of Northumbria in 1055 but wasn't popular. Harold ousted him on behalf of King Edward the Confessor in 1065. That's the bit that we're going to be looking at today. Tostig sided with Harold Hardrada in 1066 as a result. Let's have a look at the rising against Earl Tostig. Firstly, some context. Notice on this map here that there is a purple line and an orange area shaded as the Danelaw. Some earlier Viking possessions are also shown on the west coast of Wales and Scotland. You can ignore those, but this gives a generalisation. The Danelaw was a division of England dating back to a peace treaty with the Vikings. North of the Roman Watling Street, the Vikings would rule. South of it, the Saxons would. However, by 1060 the King of England ruled all of England, but the Viking customs and privileges often survived in the north. That provides some cultural background for what happens next. Some context for you. One of the problems Tostig had was cultural. Despite having a Danish mother and name, Tostig was from Wessex. When he was made Earl of Northumbria, Tostig saw that the laws, language and customs in the north were rather different to the south, and he thought that this was unfair. In particular, he felt that he could charge the people in the north more tax on behalf of Edward the Confessor, and possibly to pay for his own war in Wales. The northern thanes were not impressed. And remember, at this time an earl needed to maintain his authority through loyalty from his thanes. So what went wrong for Earl Tostig in 1065? The truth is, this was a slow burn and something that gradually happened. We can split our studies into two distinct sections. Think of it as being like a gunpowder keg, with lots of ingredients going into it which are all ready to explode. Firstly, we have the causes of the rebellion, and then the consequences. Throughout this session, you might want to be making notes. You could create a spider diagram like this one here in order to organise your thoughts between the causes and the consequences, but I'll leave that up to you. But if you are going to take some notes, you could structure them like this. What was the role of Malcolm of Scotland? What was the role of taxation? The laws? And Tostig's background? And then consider the consequences. Why did Harold deal with the rebellion in the way that he did? What was Tostig's reaction? And how exactly did Harold deal with it? All of those things are going to become relevant and shall be revealed in the next couple of minutes. So watch on. This is all part of the wider context of the last years of Edward the Confessor and the succession crisis that followed. Edward the Confessor ruled from 1042 until his death in 1066. During his reign, the power of the House of Godwin increased. This caused some problems. When he died in 1066, a succession crisis occurred over who should be the next king. Let's see how the risings against Tostig played out. Tostig Godwinson became Earl of Northumbria in 1055 after the death of Earl Seward. You might have heard of him before if you're studying Macbeth in part of your English studies. He's a minor character at the end of the play, an English nobleman who moves north to support Malcolm. More on him in a moment. Northumbria was an important earldom because it was a very large place and it guarded the border with Scotland. It also had a long history of Viking attacks and settlement. Because it had a long association with the Vikings, and was a long way from the power base of the Anglo-Saxon kings in the south, it was the obvious place for the Vikings to make new invasion attempts. In 1065, several Northumbrian thanes rose up against Tostig's rule. But let's consider why. So why did people rise up against Tostig? Firstly, culture. Northumbria was very different to Wessex and Godwin's power base in the south of England. Much of it had been part of the Danelaw, the area that had been settled by the Vikings in the past. There were some different laws and customs, hence Dane law. People in the Danelaw used lots of words borrowed from the Scandinavian languages of the Vikings. That remains true to today, to some extent. And so essentially we've got a divide between north versus south. Because of these cultural differences, many Northumbrians felt it best that they should be ruled by northerners from that area. They felt that they would understand it better. Most Anglo-Saxon kings had not interfered with Northumbria too much, knowing that they might become rebellious. And many people in Northumbria did not like being ruled by a southerner, and felt as if Tostig did not understand them. So where did Tostig go wrong? Firstly, taxation. Northumbria was used to paying fewer taxes than the rest of England. Tostig raised taxes in Northumbria, but particularly to pay for his war in Wales, and this caused a real amount of anger. There were also accusations of unfairness from his rule. Many Northumbrians accused Tostig of being unjust and unfair. They said that he used his legal powers to remove rivals, and even said that he abused his powers to accuse people of crimes in order to find them and take their land. He also introduced some unpopular new laws. He introduced laws that were common in the south, but had never been used in the Danelaw. This upset the Northumbrians, as they had their own laws and customs, as we've seen earlier from the Danelaw. So already we've got the people in the north resenting Tostig's rule. There were also problems with Scotland. Tostig was good friends with Malcolm III, King of Scotland. Okay, again, for anyone who's studying Macbeth, that's the same Malcolm as is in the end of the play, the son of Duncan who becomes king at the end. Spoilers. Anyway, back to your history lesson. While Tostig was away on pilgrimage in 1061, King Malcolm invaded Northumbria and caused much destruction. However, when Tostig returned, he did not launch an attack on Malcolm, but instead agreed peace terms with him, giving up land. This made him look somewhat weak, and definitely did not satisfy the people who had been attacked. Then we have what might be called the spark, what sets all of this off into an open rebellion. Tostig invited two thanes loyal to a noble named Gospatric to his hall at York. They were murdered, which angered Gospatric, as you might expect. Gospatric complained to Edward, but was himself murdered in 1064. So we've got a combination of taxation, law, problems with Scotland, and political murders that all mix together into an explosive combination. So what actually happened during the risings? Large numbers of Northumbrian thanes rose up against Tostig's rule in October of 1065, killing members of his household in York and Lincoln and pushing south as far as Oxford. The local trouble in the north had become a national issue for King Edward the Confessor. The rebels invited a man named Morcar to become their new earl. This was Morcar of Mercia. He was the son of the old Earl of Mercia, Elfgar. Edward ordered his earls to meet the rebels in battle and put down the rebellion. However, Edward by this point was a sick king who lots of people thought was going to die very soon. He had lost an awful lot of his authority, despite being quite a weak king anyway. The earls failed to obey his command and did not rise against their enemies. Instead, Harold Godwinson met with the rebels and agreed to their demands. Ultimately, Edward had no choice, and Harold was able to claim that he was acting on the king's behalf. Morcar was made Earl of Northumbria, and Tostig was exiled in November of 1065. So what was in this for Harold? Well, Harold married Morcar's sister, his second wife, which was just about legal at that time, and he was giving large land holdings in Mercia, where Morcar's brother Edwin was Earl. This meant that Harold had become an incredibly powerful man, not only dominating Wessex, but also having influence in Mercia and a lot of say over what went on in Northumbria. The Godwin family by this point pretty much ran England. So why did Harold end up betraying his brother? Edward the Confessor was old and ill. It is possible that Harold was showing his power by disobeying him to prove that he was strong enough to be the next king. Harold needed a united kingdom to hold off all the threats from Normandy and Scandinavia that he knew was brewing. A war with Mercia and Northumbria would weaken English defences just when they needed to be at their strongest. And Tostig was a rival to the throne, and this removal meant that he was no longer able to challenge Harold. If you wanted to take a screenshot or pause this video to make your own notes, you could do that at this point. If not, let's move on to our final points. When did this happen? Well, Tostig became Earl in 1055, increasingly fell out with his earls. King Malcolm invaded in 1061, Political murders occurred in 1064, and the full-scale uprising against Tostig occurred in 1065. Why? Well, Tostig was unpopular because he was from Wessex and didn't understand the customs of the Danelaw. He tried to raise taxes. He was also friends with Malcolm of Scotland, who had attacked the north in 1061. He also murdered thanes who opposed him, including Gospatric in 1064. So this all took place in Northumbria, but also further south as well. This was part of the culturally Viking Danelaw in Northumbria, with its own laws and customs distinct from the south. So what happened and why was it important? Edward the Confessor sent Harold Godwinson to put down the rebellion, or at the very least that's what was claimed. Harold did this by exiling his brother Tostig and installing Morcar in his place. Tostig was exiled, first to Scotland, and then, as you might know, he sided with Harald Hardrada of Norway in his invasion in 1066. Edward the Confessor's weakness as a king was exposed. Harold had shown his strength, making him a more likely candidate for the next King of England, which is precisely what happened. So that's quite a complicated story that I've tried to do as briefly as possible, but it's still roughly double the length of most of my rapid revision videos. But it is something that is worth knowing. Hopefully you found that useful and interesting, and if you have, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. If there's anything that you're desperate for me to cover, please give a comment and I'll have a look at it and see if I can sort it out. Thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.